Welcome back to Monitors Unboxed. It's time for a Q&A session, and boy, has there been a lot of new monitor releases since the last of these Q&A videos. I think I last did one in like November of 2023, so nearly 6 months ago now. And yeah, I've just been flat out testing OLED monitors. We've had some mini LED LCDs in there as well to talk about. So yeah, I thought it's a good time to get in there and answer some of your questions. So without further ado, let's get to the questions. Which one provides a better HDR experience for games and movies? A monitor with HDR True Black 500 OLED, for example, or one with HDR 1000 to 1400 mini LED? Which certification means that the displayed HDR is closer to what the content creator has intended? So I'll just answer that last part first. Most of the display HDR specifications and criteria relate to the hardware characteristics of the panel, so things like brightness, black depth, contrast, those sorts of things. There are some accuracy requirements, so delta E accuracy, but they're the same for all of the tiers, so it doesn't really matter whether you're talking HDR True Black or HDR 1000 or 1400, the accuracy delta E stuff is all the same. And generally when we talk about like getting closer to what the content creator is intended, this means all of the various different characteristics. So brightness, black depth, and very importantly, the color accuracy, things like skin tones looking natural, no crazy, incorrect white balances, those sorts of things. So none of that really matters, the accuracy side of things. We've seen some monitors that are quite poorly calibrated that still use the display HDR tiers. So I wouldn't really look into, true black versus non-true black in terms of accuracy. As for which one provides a better HDR experience for games and movies, I mean, this really comes down to the sorts of content that you're playing on these monitors and the sorts of things that you prefer. OLEDs are still optimized more towards darker scenes, and LCD is more optimized towards brighter scenes. So if you're playing a lot of nature documentaries, outdoor bright scenes with sunlight, and also games that might be set outdoors mostly, then an LCD with its powerful full screen brightness capabilities is going to potentially give you a better image quality, whereas with OLED, the optimizations are more around shadow detail, black depth, showing those bright highlights in dark scenes. So things like night scenes, even indoor scenes can often look better on OLED. And this really depends, again, on the content that you're playing. A lot of movies typically are lower brightness and lower APL, which can make an OLED monitor look better, which is why I generally prefer OLED for HDR content. It's more rare that you'll see those bright full screen scenes. I know some people at the moment are talking about, let's say, the latest QD OLED monitors and how they look for things like snowy scenes. Snow is very bright, it reflects a lot of sun, there'll be the sky as well, which is bright. But among the vast majority of content, you're not often seeing snowy scenes. It's more common that you'll see indoor scenes, darker scenes, not necessarily light night scenes, but certainly darker than a snowy outdoor scene, for example. So again, it's a personal preference sort of thing. I think that across the majority of content that I see, I think OLED tends to handle things better. And that's from a number of other perspectives as well. So brightness, obviously for LCDs is one standpoint, but then you've got things like per pixel control on the OLED side where, you may see some blooming artifacts if you've got an HDR LCD in certain scenes, especially if you're a lover of subtitles. I know some people like watching movies with subtitles enabled. LCDs, you'll see a lot of blooming around subtitles. OLEDs can show things like subtitles better. So there's no clear winner here. I'm not able to sit here and say definitely an OLED is always superior for HDR because there are weaknesses for things like full screen brightness. But, it does depend on the content that you're after. So you have to think about what are the sorts of games I'm playing? What are the sorts of things that I like about these monitors? Do I want the speed of OLED? Am I satisfied more with the brightness of LCD, for example? So yeah, lots of things to consider, but yeah, no right answer, I don't think, at the moment. How important should the inclusion of Dolby Vision be when making a buying decision for a 4K OLED monitor? So Dolby Vision is most important if you're planning on using non-Windows source devices. So I'm thinking about media players, things like your Nvidia Shield, Apple TV, those sorts of things, as well as game consoles. Some games do support, I believe now, Dolby Vision on consoles, so things like Xbox Series X, PlayStation 5. Those are the main considerations for wanting Dolby Vision. Windows support and Windows game support for Dolby Vision is not very good. So you're not really going to be playing Dolby Vision videos through Windows in its current state. It's unlikely that you'll find very many Dolby Vision games. So if you're primarily a PC gamer and that's what you're doing, you'll be mostly concerned with HDR10 performance because that's what the vast majority of PC games play at the moment. But if you're someone that likes, let's say, watching movies, for example, the best way to watch a movie on one of these 4K OLED displays is to use an external media player that's dedicated to media playback. So something like an Apple TV or an NVIDIA Shield, like I talked about, that support Dolby Vision. You can get a really good experience out of those playing the best HDR format that there is for video content. So it's really a mixed use case thing. We talk about mixed use for things like productivity work and gaming. That's often a common use case, but we have to acknowledge as well that a lot of people like watching movies on their 4K OLED monitor. It's a great way to watch movies. So yeah, Dolby Vision is going to be important for those people and important for people that are using external source devices primarily. Is it the awful naming, the misleading specs, or terrible OSDs? What truly is your biggest pet peeve about reviewing monitors? Yeah, I mean, things like the naming and the specifications and things have frustrated me over the years. I think the specification thing, that's bad, but we've seen some improvements outside of the response time things. I think monitor manufacturers generally are avoiding some of the pitfalls that may come about with specifications, especially with things around, say, DisplayPort and HDMI connectivity. Most monitor manufacturers are sticking with things like HDMI 2.0 instead of saying that it's 2.1, but only with the capabilities of 2.0. So generally, I find, especially with our checklist section of our reviews, that monitor manufacturers are doing the advertising side of things reasonably well. I wouldn't say perfectly, but certainly to a reasonable level. I think what annoys me the most is more the naming side, and not necessarily just the naming of products, which is very bad, but more the whole marketing and hype cycles around monitors. I think a lot of companies have done a bad job of marketing high quality displays to gamers. I think a lot of gamers who watch Monitors Unboxed would be aware of what the good quality displays are, like what an OLED is, what it means, what actually are the OLED monitors, like what are the product names that mean you're getting an OLED. However, I think, a lot of companies just don't do a great job of this. They don't do a great job of selling their own products. Like, these are high quality displays that really enhance the gaming experience. I think for a lot of people, buying a high-end, good quality HDR monitor will give you a better gaming upgrade than, say, getting a high performance GPU like an RTX 4090. The RTX 4090 and QD-OLED monitors, the RTX 4090 is a little bit more expensive, but we're talking about over $1,000 products, right? So I think monitor manufacturers need to get much better at marketing their products to customers, making the names much more straightforward and simple so that you can easily remember them, and that helps you think about buying them because they're more, the brand names are more at the forefront of your mind. It makes it easier to remember. And then on top of that, I think some monitor manufacturers, they make too many monitors. So you'll see their lineup across the year and there'll be, 10, 20, 30 monitors being released. I think if there was more a focus on a couple of really good products that you could put your whole brand behind and advertise really accurately and in a way that gets people hyped about monitors, that would be a much better way of going about it. Instead of producing like, MSI at the moment, it's producing multiple variants of the same sort of OLED monitors, makes it hard to know the differences between the products. We've seen in the LCD space, there's been, you often have monitors released one year that's really no different to the monitor released the previous year. That doesn't really need to exist if there's no legitimate benefits or improvements to that product. So I think if there was a focus on a couple of just awesome, really well tuned, really well calibrated, high tier products that you could point to and be like, this is our flagship product, it's got an easy to remember name, this is a really good thing that you should be buying right now. I think that would benefit the monitor ecosystem overall because I feel like a lot of people watch our content, they're very confused by the wide array of options that you can get. You throw in not just all the options from one brand, but all the other brands. I think if there was a bit more consolidation, a bit more focus, then people would find it a lot easier to find the products that they're after, to know what products are the best quality, and then, people would have a much better gaming experience overall. Are you unable to review mini LED options due to companies not shipping or selling them in Australia? Yeah, this is a reasonably big problem for reviewing more the LCD side of monitors. For some reason, we get a lot of the OLEDs here. A lot of the mini LED stuff doesn't always come to Australia. I think that comes down to a few things. Firstly, just the brands that are producing mini LED monitors. There's a lot of more China-specific OEMs that have been talked about. It's hard to get those in Australia without importing them. There's a lot of smaller brands as well that are more focusing on, say, the American market, which again, we don't really get United United States or North American products that are specific to that market very often. So yeah, those two things do affect the ability to get some of those lesser known brands that don't really focus on Australia. Some of the time, even the more known brands like AOC, for example, we recently reviewed what I think is a really great budget quality, mini LED HDR monitor from AOC, and they're not selling it in Australia. We had to import it. It cost hundreds upon hundreds of dollars just to import it, pay all the duties, custom fees, those sorts of things. And for a lot of products, it's just not worth doing that. So we really have to pick and choose when we're importing monitors, whether we think, products have broad appeal on the channel. Do they even have wide availability? Because products without wide availability tend to have lower interest on the channel. So these are all the sorts of things that play into why we choose to review some products and why we choose not to review some products. So I'd love to review more mini LED products. We looked at earlier this year, we had I think we looked at a Cooler Master, AOC, Acer products, sort of in that more budget range. Some of those were available in Australia, but yeah, a lot of the time with those products, it really depends on, can the manufacturer either sell them in Australia so that we can buy them with little to no fuss, or provide them to us via shipping them directly to us. Some brands are willing to do that, others are not. So yeah, that's currently the state of those things. There are some products that I'm keen on checking out throughout the rest of the year that I haven't gotten to that I think I should be able to get. I know people have been requesting, I think there's an LG monitor with over 1,000 LCD mini LED zones, so hopefully we'll get to testing some of those products throughout the year. But yeah, remains a challenge for us here in Australia on these sorts of review units or buying hardware sort of perspective. If you've already bought a 1440p 240Hz OLED but you're interested in upgrading to 4K 240Hz, are this year's offerings decent enough to upgrade now, or do you foresee better things on the horizon in the next 12 to 18 months? So I'm assuming that if you've bought a 1440p 240Hz OLED that you've bought one of the WOLED monitors, because those were the only ones that were available last year. Nowadays, obviously, you can get 1440p 360Hz QD-OLED as well, but I'm assuming you mean WOLED here. I think the panel differences between the 4K 240Hz QD-OLEDs or even the WOLEDs that we see now compared to the 1440p WOLEDs from last year, that it is a big difference. Things like just the text quality makes them much more usable outside of gaming and content consumption, standpoints. I think, specifically relating to things like QD-OLED, you may prefer the glossy screen coating. The WOLEDs only had matte screen coatings previously, things like better uniformity as well. Even, both the WOLED and QD-OLED variants are also brighter in the 4K monitors. So again, that does depend on the specific window sizes that we're testing at and real scenes as well, but generally speaking, the QD-OLEDs are brighter, and obviously it's a larger panel as well, which could be of benefit to you. So there's no doubting that the 4K 240Hz monitors that we've seen throughout this year are better than the 1440p 240Hz monitors from last year. And I think for some people that will be worth the upgrade, even though it is after a year and they're very expensive monitors. Potentially you could sell your old monitor and get a decent amount back for that. And on top of that as well, just another thing I've thought of is that a lot of these new 4K monitors do have better burn-in warranties as well than we saw for those initial 1440p WOLEDs. But anyway, yeah, I think they're better monitors. As for thinking about buying now or waiting to do that upgrade, what are we going to be seeing a few years from now? I think a lot of the things that people would be looking for to wait would be things like, for example, on the QD-OLED side, changing the panel structure and composition so that it reflects less of the ambient light so that you don't get that raised black level situation in brighter environments. I think as well, just the brightness in general, people would be after higher brightness, better tuning for some of those high APL scenes so that we get better sustained brightness across the entire panel, and also better brightness for even just mid APL content. Some of those QD-OLEDs is not great. WOLEDs could do with some improvements to things like actually offering glossy panels. That would be nice, right? So, yeah, I think a lot of those things potentially are going to have slower development over the coming years. It's not clear whether in 2025, for example, we're going to get a revolutionary new panel from Samsung that addresses a lot of those concerns. What we've seen from the WOLED side has been more gradual improvements. So the panels that we have in 2024, they are brighter than the panels that we saw in 2023, but they're not addressing everything that I think buyers would like to see from OLEDs in terms of brightness. So yeah, it's a hard one on that one. I mean, if you have just bought a 1440p WOLED and you're really happy with it, then I could certainly see a reason to wait, because they're probably going to get cheaper. And I think that's probably one of the main reasons, that one of the main benefits that you would get from waiting at the moment is that Potentially in 18 months, there'll be a lot more competition for these panels. We're already seeing, MSI has been able to produce these products below $1,000 US. If that trends in that direction, they'll be getting cheaper over the next couple of years. So yeah, that could be the reason to wait, and you won't be upgrading after a year, which will be a bit of a weird thing to do. But yeah, as I said, there's reasons to wait. There's reasons not to wait because the monitors are better today than they were in previous years. But really, I can't make that call for you. You're going to have to decide, what's your use case, what do you like from your display, and also how much you're willing to factor in things like pricing adjustments over the next few years into your buying decision. Why do manufacturers keep making massive ultra-wide 1440p monitors instead of making 1600p monitors in the same size? Why did they kill off the 1600p resolution? So usually when it comes to format decision like panel size, panel resolution, a lot of that is driven by market research and also the buying preferences of people. If they've made a 34-inch 1440p class monitor and a 38-inch 1600p class monitor, and the 34-inch model is selling way better than the 38-inch model, which definitely seems to have been the case previously, then they're going to prioritize the 34-inch variants. And I think maybe some of that would have come down to the pricing of those monitors. The 38 inches monitors, those were quite a bit more expensive. So maybe if there was a bit more investment in there would have been more panel options, better pricing. People have preferred those over time, but it seems generally that most buyers have preferred the 34-inch size. So unfortunately, that means, as we sort of said, the 38-inch size gets deprioritized. That resolution kind of goes away. And with things like OLED, there's further complications to that. Some of the panel types that we've been talking about in terms of, especially the ultrawides, the 34 and 49-inch ultrawides, they can be offcuts from other panels that have been manufactured specifically for TVs and those sorts of things. It's not always the case. Some panels are being made specifically for monitor use, but some of the times these are sort of almost byproducts of other configurations. So if they can get a 34-inch panel out of the larger master sizes that they're using in manufacturing, but a 38-inch panel is much more difficult, then again, they're going to be prioritizing the 34-inch panel. I think, though, it was weird to see the new 39-inch W OLED panels and those not using a higher resolution. Maybe, I'm assuming this is down to manufacturing and the densities that they've got available for them with W OLED manufacturing, but it does seem weird that they wouldn't just create a higher resolution version of that panel. It seems more like that they've just created a lot of base hardware, so whether that's like the scaler and processing features and whatnot, and then they've just changed the 34-inch panel to the 39-inch panel at the exact same resolution. It's probably a pretty easy thing for them to do in manufacturing. Again, I'm not saying that I know for sure that it's easy for them to do, but from an engineering standpoint, usually the fewer things that you change between one model and another model, the easier it is to manufacture, the less development costs that have to go into that product. So that seems like what they've done, sort of test the waters here a little bit. Even the 45-inch panels that they've also produced, really those should have a much higher resolution than they do. That's another really bizarre sort of format that they went with there. So yeah, it's disappointing. It's unusual. I'd like to think that if they wanted to make the 39-inch size a success, and I really do think that that size can be a great success for gamers because it is larger, it's more immersive, it's a great size for gaming, really. I think that they do need to think about the resolution of these panels, make them more dense, really think about how are gamers wanting to use these panels. If they want to use it for even the smallest amount of productivity or text use, the resolution needs to be much higher. And I think even going above 3840 by 1600 would be ideal. I'd go the next step above that even at 39-inch. That would give us more potentially around what we're seeing from the new 4K panels in terms of its density and pixel quality, because with W OLED, the quality of those panels really is quite good for text and those sorts of use cases. So that's what I'd be doing, focusing on exactly what gamers would want from that sort of panel. I'd reduce the curve as well from 800R down to 1800R. I think that would make it much more broad appeal from those monitors. But yeah, my worry is that they've made these monitors, they've made the panels, they haven't made them to the best that they could be, and sales potentially won't be great from a product that isn't doing all the things that gamers want, and that would potentially give LG Display the incentive to not produce that panel anymore. I'd like to see them do the complete opposite, just ignore what the data says on buying in terms of sales and those sorts of things, and just go all in on making that panel as good as it possibly can be with a high pixel density and a reduced curve. I think that would go well for monitors. So yeah, The size, it gets a thumbs up from me. Please invest more in that panel format. I think it's great, but we'll have to see what happens. There seems to be a lot of hate about the MSI 321 UPX for not having firmware updates, which is understandable. However, has there been a product that's been drastically changed in the past by a firmware update that wasn't fundamentally broken originally, like the Cooler Master Tempest? So yeah, I mean, some of those Cooler Master monitors have been more broken than others and required more significant firmware updates to get them into a usable state. But I think there's been quite a range of other monitors where, you know, I wouldn't say they've been broken, but performance has certainly not been quite where it could have been from those products. I'm thinking of, for example, the Alienware AW3423DWF, which had not a very good peak 1000 nit mode. They updated the firmware, it worked a lot better, delivering much better EOTF tracking. You know, the Asus PG27AQDM, that had some color brightness issues, which they managed to resolve through a firmware update. There was the LG 27GR95QE, they increased the brightness on that monitor slightly, tuned it up a little bit through a firmware update. We've seen as well, I think lately was it the Dell Alienware, the AW3225QF. That monitor had some issues with Dolby Vision in Windows, and they managed to add in a firmware toggle that would allow you to turn off Dolby Vision and improve compatibility with Windows, even though the monitor was actually working correctly out of the box in terms of processing Dolby Vision signals. And then aside from, you know, improving the performance of some of these products and just making that aspect of things better, a lot of firmware updates more typically address quality of life things. So there can be some, you know, specific configuration issues that people find with monitors where if you're doing one specific use case, then there might be some sort of issue with how the firmware operates that's not particularly great, and you might want to have it updated so that it's nicer to use on a daily basis. I think back to the AW3423DW, so not the DWF model, the original 34-inch ultrawide. There were certainly some annoyances with how that monitor would produce its, what was it, like the pixel refresh, the pixel cleaning functionality of OLEDs. You'd see pop-ups at times where it really shouldn't have been popping up. It wasn't going into those modes correctly in standby and those sorts of things. There was some fan behavior that wasn't ideal as well. So they're able to address some of those quality of life aspects through firmware updates. We've seen that again with just a variety of different monitors and features. So I think firmware updates, they are important even for monitors that do not necessarily require them in terms of performance. There are certainly monitors where it's nice to have the ability for small things that we find in reviews to be tuned up over time. I think it's, you know, monitors, they don't require firmware updates. They're not like a GPU, for example, where NVIDIA, AMD, Intel, they need to be constantly producing driver updates to tackle the latest and greatest games to make sure it's optimized and you're getting the best performance out of them. Monitors, they don't need that. They don't need per game updates. Theoretically, a monitor manufacturer could create the perfect firmware and ship it on the product and there'd be no need for updates whatsoever. But because of development timelines, the amount of time that the engineers can focus on these products and the amount of configurations that they can test across a wide variety of hardware configurations, input devices, those sorts of things, there tends to be times with high-end products where we see that there are some configurations that just aren't ideal, and especially if you're spending a lot of money on these products, I think it's nice to at least have the ability for firmware updates to be put through to the monitor at some point to address some of the quality of life things. So even if the updates are minor, I still think it's worth having firmware updates as a feature of a product. So I am planning on testing the MSI, the 321 UPX, the version that does not have firmware updates, to see exactly how it performs out of the box, because how that monitor performs out of the box is the performance that you're getting. If there's any bugs or issues or quality of life things that could be improved via firmware updates, then that monitor is not going to get them. So yeah, it's interesting. I think generally we see that a lot of monitor manufacturers are keen on receiving the feedback that we push out in reviews so that they can update the firmware of their products, make them better for users. I think a lot of manufacturers generally do care about their products and do want them to be the best that they can be. So yeah, as it stands right now, I'm still very much in the camp that, especially for high-end products, for the best flagship products on the market today, that firmware updates are an essential part of that process and really is a key feature that buyers should be looking out for. Has there ever been a display panel technology where the differences between different display models using the same panel type is as small as the differences between different OLEDs within the same type of OLED? It feels like the display vendors are really struggling to differentiate their products from the competition with both WOLED and QD-OLED. I think that's true to some degree with QD-OLED monitors in particular. What we've seen across a lot of the 4K releases is that the performance tuning side of things is very similar. So brightness characteristics, EOTF tracking, color calibration in the SDR and HDR modes is very similar between the products. And it seems like the panels are being shipped to these manufacturers in a state that is quite well pre-calibrated, I'd say, so that when it gets to a Dell, an MSI, or an Asus, they don't need to provide all that much additional tweaking to get them into a really good state, which certainly is what, at least that appears to be what's happening, because the differences that we're seeing across the different panels is very similar. There are some feature differences between those monitors though, so it's not just 100% on the QD-OLED panel for the final performance that we see from monitors. For example, the Alienware model is the only model with Dolby Vision at the moment. The Asus model is the only model that has ELMB black frame insertion at the moment. Now, you could argue that maybe those features aren't major selling points for some buyers, that they're not differences in things like response time performance or refresh rate or color calibration, which you may prefer more in terms of what you're looking for on a monitor. But there are some differences that monitor manufacturers are able to put into their monitors. Port selection is another one. We've seen some monitors with things like USB-C with power delivery. Some monitors do not have that feature, and that may be the deciding point for you as well. The Alienware model has a curve. The other variants do not have a curve. So there are some things that the manufacturers can do. But yes, there isn't that much difference between the fundamental aspects to performance for QD-OLED. That said, that's not unusual for other panels as well. I think what we see across, say, LCDs, for example, is simply that there are many more panels to choose from. When we're talking about OLEDs, there's just 2 panel manufacturers that are producing gaming class OLEDs at the moment. And as far as those panels are concerned, there's even fewer subvariants, right? Like there's one 32-inch 4K QD-OLED panel. There's one 32-inch 4K WOLED panel. Even among LCD manufacturers, LG Display might produce multiple different 27-inch 1440p IPS variants, even at the same refresh rate. There will be newer and newer generation panels that are coming through. So there's a whole variety of panels that manufacturers can choose from to put in their monitors. And on top of that, for LCDs, you've got more manufacturers. You've got LG, you've got CSOT, you've got Innolux, you've got AU Optronics, you've got BOE. Like there's so many panel manufacturers for LCDs. And I think that's why we see so much more variance between the products that we see on the market. You occasionally see some monitors that use the exact same panel. There was a time there with 28-inch 4K monitors that were using the same panel, and we saw very similar performance characteristics between them, especially for response time tuning. But then things like accuracy were a bit different across the models. But yeah, I think that largely explains the differences that we see there. I think if you saw monitor manufacturers producing 5 or 6 from each of the different brands monitors that all use the exact same LCD panel, that you would see very similar performance characteristics between them as well. That said, there are more knobs that you can tweak with an LCD. Response time tuning is a big part of that. How many overdrive modes you include, calibration as well can differ a bit between LCDs. But yeah, I mean, I think there will be a future where there are many more OLED panels to choose from. I know a lot of the other manufacturers as well are working on OLED technology, and they do currently produce OLEDs for different use cases. Not currently at the moment are we seeing gaming OLEDs from those brands, but sometimes you'll see them in laptops and other use cases. So I think there will be a future where there'll be much more variance between panels. Manufacturers will be able to choose the panels that they want for their specific products, and we will see more differences. But yeah, at the moment, it comes down more to things like the around the edges features. How's the calibration looking? Where's it tweaked the best? Where's the port selection looking like? What are the features like Dolby Vision and so on going into those products that really come down to the ultimate, how good is the product in the end? So yeah, there's been a lot of repetition with those reviews. I'd like to see a few more changes, but I guess if the similarities between the products means that the products themselves are good, then that's generally a good thing, I would say. Tim, the recent budget HDR LCDs have been spoilt by tuning and firmware issues. Do you expect things to get better? Should we expect similar issues with future budget OLEDs? I mean, I think things will get better because we're reviewing them. So when we review products, hopefully the messages get through to the manufacturers at times to improve things for the future. And yeah, some of the issues, I think some of it comes down to early teething issues with some configurations, especially dealing with the SDR to HDR transition. And I don't just mean that from the monitor changing from the HDR to SDR modes, because we have seen issues with that. I mean more monitor manufacturers dealing with mostly making SDR monitors and now having to work in an HDR ecosystem with panels that can truly do HDR, because a lot of the monitors that they've been producing previously that advertised HDR on the box, let's be honest, they weren't true HDR products. They weren't really giving us the HDR experience that we should be expecting from monitors that can actually do HDR for real. So I think there are some teething issues there. I think as well, a lot of those mini LED products that we've been looking at lately have been more budget, mid-range, lower cost products. And it doesn't really matter what type of panel that you're using. Budget products typically have more issues with them, generally speaking. That's probably because there's lower margins on those products. They can't justify as much development time into them. So really tuning them to the best level and those sorts of things isn't a high priority for those products, as opposed to, say, the OLEDs that we're seeing today, where if you're spending over $1,000 US, your expectations are different. You're expecting better tuning and better performance because you're spending so much money. Whereas if you're spending $300, $400, $500, it's still a fair bit of money at times, but the expectations are a little different from those HDR products. So what I'm hoping is that we're seeing a lot of these first generation products with issues that by the time we see second generation iterations that are still using full array local dimming mini LED panels, that they've learnt from some of the issues that we're seeing, particularly around EOTF tracking, particularly around how do we switch from the HDR to SDR modes, making sure that that process is as painless as possible. And I think some of that will come with more powerful scalar hardware as well. I think that some of the lower cost monitors that we're seeing today, the scalars that they're using, they're certainly capable of HDR. The AOC, was it the Q27G3 XMN? Might not have gotten that right off the top of my head. But that product, like, it works well for HDR, but it's clear that it doesn't have as many of the capabilities as you would see from a higher tier OLED monitor, simply because the scaler has its capabilities and can't really do more than what it's currently got in those specific panels. So if the panels are paired with better scalers in the future, more powerful scalers that can do more things, then I think that you would see the performance of those products improve as well. And again, it comes down to sales on top of all these things. So if people aren't buying those monitors, then companies like Acer, Cooler Master, AOC that we've been recently testing have less incentive to put time into making those products better. But if lots of people are buying those monitors, they're flooding the market, people are just going crazy for them. I hope people are going crazy for that AOC $280 HDR monitor because it is a really good product. Then I think you'll see more and more effort put into creating those products and making them really, really good. As we've seen from the transition to fast IPS monitors, when they first came out, there were a few teething problems, but then they've been optimized, and you see much more high quality, you see more variety of high quality budget entry-level gaming monitors using LCDs. So yeah, I don't think it's a forever problem. As for like budget OLEDs coming in, I can't expect a budget OLED to be around the price of some of those monitors just yet. So I still expect there to be reasonable levels of tuning there. And on top of that, it seems like some monitors, QD OLEDs, their performance doesn't vary all that much between the monitors using the same panel. So things like brightness characteristics are going to be pretty similar, whether you got a high-end or a budget monitor using the exact same panel. Obviously, response times across OLEDs are pretty much identical as well. So there's less opportunity for a monitor manufacturer to stuff up the overdrive tuning on an OLED because overdrive's not needed at all and you don't really need to tune them. So yeah, I think if over time, as OLEDs start coming more down into the budget and mid-range categories, that they won't have as many issues as some of the HDR products that we've seen. But there's no guarantee that we would see things like good HDR, SDR switching or good color accuracy or unlocked sRGB modes, for example, on a budget OLED. Those are all still areas that a manufacturer could theoretically not put as much time into and create a lower quality product. But, we'll see. We'll see what happens there because, like I said, I don't think OLEDs are going to quite be in that price category anytime soon. Can modern VA mini LEDs offer a superior HDR experience to QD OLEDs due to their advantages in brightness and ambient black levels? Or are blooming and slow response times usually more detrimental than lower brightness and ambient contrast? So yeah, this is a very interesting question, and I think it ties back to what we were talking about earlier with the question on OLED versus LED LCDs for the HDR specifications like display HDR and those sorts of things. So can a modern VA mini LED offer a superior HDR experience to QD OLEDs? They can in some circumstances, for sure. What we've seen from, again, that budget AOC monitor is that it does genuinely have much brighter full screen brightness for HDR use cases. And there are some tests that we've done. For example, our high APL gaming test, which is a scene from Cyberpunk that essentially just points directly at the sun. The VA LCD just completely mops the floor with QD OLEDs there in terms of brightness. And in those types of scenes where they're super bright, the APL is really being pushed, they're trying to get to like 4 to 600 nits of sky brightness or whatever. Yeah, a VA LCD with a mini LED backlight that's tuned well and offers good levels of brightness will, just completely destroy QD OLEDs in those sorts of scenes. And then for ambient black levels, I assume you're talking about, for example, in a brighter ambient environment, the issues with QD OLED panels reflecting a bit of the light, maybe activating the QD layer, and it appearing a bit grayer as opposed to the black that it really should be. Yes, some VAs can look better in those circumstances because the panel composition of the VA LCD is going to play a bit nicer in a higher ambient brightness environment, especially because most of them do use matte coatings. So on those standpoints, the things you've been talking about in this question with brightness advantages, ambient black levels, yes, VA will have an advantage there. However, things like blooming and slow response times, I would say that they can be more detrimental for gaming. And I say that because high APL scenes, and I was talking about this earlier, high APL scenes, they do exist, but they're not, it depends on the content you're viewing. Some games are brighter than others, but generally brightness is in the mid APL or low APL range, generally speaking, especially for video content. So when we're talking about things like the advantages that LCDs have for very bright scenes, you have to think about how often you're seeing very bright scenes where you'll benefit from the high APL advantages that an LCD can bring versus gaming in, say, darker scenes, playing movies that are darker, where you will see the benefits of OLED. So that's a toss-up, right? It depends on the content that you're talking about. However, things like blooming and slow response times are typically issues across all content. So whether we're talking high APL scenes or low APL scenes, the slow response times of a VA, and it does depend on the monitor as to how slow you're seeing, that affects all games. So no matter whether you're playing Cyberpunk at night or whether you're playing a game like, I don't know, let's say Dragon's Dogma 2 that I've been playing recently, which has some brighter outdoor scenes, again, response times affect both of those scenarios, and that's where OLEDs can have that advantage. Blooming as well, and even we'll show on screen here some of the artifacts that you can see from the backlight in motion on a VA LCD, where the zones are activating as you're moving across the screen. You're seeing different bright elements activating the backlights as things move, and obviously blooming can be issues as well in some scenes. You know, that's not in every single scene, but it doesn't matter whether it's a bright scene or a dark scene. You can still see things like blooming and zone transition issues with LCDs across a wide variety of content. So yeah, when we're talking about like, can a VA LCD provide an overall better experience than an OLED? I think if it was really well tuned and it had a sufficient backlight zone count and everything was working really nicely, it had great response times, that yeah, you could get a really good experience out of that sort of panel that would match an OLED or even outperform it in some areas. I think though, where things stand at the moment, it's very much a case-by-case basis. So as I said, things like response times, that can affect all gaming scenarios. Things like where the brightness impacts, VAs having higher brightness impacts some scenes. OLEDs having better dark level performance, less blooming can benefit other scenes. So unfortunately at the moment, with where we're at in terms of LCD and OLED capabilities, you do have to think about your use case, the types of content that you're thinking of playing or viewing on these sorts of panels, and also just your personal preferences as well. If you think that you're more interested in shadow detail, contrast, dark scenes, that's where you really find the benefit of HDR content, and that's where you really want to see the best performance, then you would swing more towards an OLED. But if you're someone that really likes the high peak brightness, the high full screen brightness, you like your sunny scenes to be just blindingly bright from your monitor, then you'd swing towards an LCD for sure. So hopefully there'll be a future there where VA LCDs can improve in the areas that they're weak, things like improving blooming performance, improving response time performance, and hopefully OLEDs can improve their brightness performance as well, and we'll get more of a convergence in the two technologies. But yeah, unfortunately, where we're at in 2024, you kind of do have to decide between the two. Anyway, that does it for this Q&A session on Monitors Unboxed in, what are we? It's April of 2024. Not that we do these every month on Monitors Unboxed, but yeah, some great questions in that Q&A series. So thanks to everyone who did submit a question, whether that's via our YouTube community tab or via our Discord chat for our Patreon and Floatplane members. If you do want to sign up to become a Discord member, then you will get access to that Q&A channel where you have almost priority access to the asking us questions for this Q&A series. We've also got some great channels in there to talk about monitor recommendations and those sorts of things. But yeah, we'll be back at some point for another Q&A throughout this year. As if you have more questions, again, we only answered just a handful of them. There were many, many more questions that definitely would have been worth answering if we had more time. So we'll be back for more Q&As throughout 2024. So subscribe to Monitors Unboxed. But yeah, that's it for this one. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.